Cocaine Cowboys, the deadly rise of Ireland's drug lords in association with Crime World. The live show is on sale now. We're coming to Belfast Waterfront Studio on Saturday, April 27th. Check mcd.ie or venue for ticket details. So when Soldier F appears for trial for murdering William McKinney and James Ray and the attempted murder of 5 others on Bloody Sunday, it'll be 52 years after the event. I mean, we had a cold case murder investigation here that ended up in a conviction in court this year. It was the coldest case, they called it, in Ireland, and it was 42 years. I mean, you're talking another 10 here. It's taken a long time for these families to see anybody standing in the dock.
It's been a massive, massive campaign to even get this far. The Bloody Sunday families are very unique in terms of how they have, I suppose, conducted themselves over the years. To take it back, it's sort of like, I always think when you look back at the beginning of this, it's almost like a sort of making, the sort of making a murderer like type Netflix type almost show. Because when you look at what happened, originally they had the Witchery Tribunal, which happened quite soon after. So Bloody Sunday takes place on the 30th of January 1972. The paratroopers attack a civil rights march, and after that, there's an inquiry where Witchery was a whitewash. Basically, he more or less justified the actions of the British Army in that day. I think he said they might have been like slightly over exuberant or whatever, but it was justified in what had happened. And so for years, that stood as the story of Bloody Sunday for those families who were left crying, I suppose, in order to get justice for their loved ones and to vindicate their loved ones and get some vindication for their name. Because a lot of these cases, I deal with so many of those troubles-related cases, and people, in this case, they've now said that there will be a prosecution. Most of them have accepted prosecutions are unlikely or just aren't going to happen, but they still want that sort of justice or the vindication. So if someone is shot and they say that they were, a member of a paramilitary organisation, that's why they were targeted, and the people know they weren't, or if it's cases where maybe people are accused of having been informants and they were killed, or, involved in some sort of activity. And in this case, obviously, by saying it was justified, they blackened the names of the dead. Mm. So that stood as the case for a long time. And then at some point then, we see the case going on to the families then contacted Peter Madden, so one half of the sort of famous Madden Finucane legal firm. The other half of that obviously being Pat Finucane, who was himself then murdered by loyalists. And they started then trying to get together some sort of information for some kind of campaign. It turned out to be such a big case that they had to bring in lots and lots of other staff and solicitors who are now partners in that case came in. And that was when they brought in people from Derry to try and track down and look for all of the people who were on that march, because they became witnesses. So Fergal and Kieran Shields, who were 2 guys from Derry, 2 brothers, who are now partners in Madden and Finucane, they had the painstaking job of going back and finding everyone who was at the march. And some of them had immigrated to other countries. Some of them still lived there. Some still lived in the same addresses, and collecting statements from them. And then they started piecing together what exactly had happened. They went to such lengths. The solicitors firm, they had like reconstructions done, because the flats had been knocked down since then. So they had a reconstruction done of what the area looked like. They got ballistics experts. I think some guy in Texas or something who's only personally had one of those original guns that were used by the parachute regiment at that time. And by the time then that the family had campaigned to get the Bloody Sunday inquiry, the Savile inquiry, a lot of the legwork had already been done by their legal firm. And Savile was just, a huge, huge, huge undertaking. Mm. At this point, I think in the Soldier F case, who we're talking about, so they've now said the Soldier F is going to be prosecuted. There's 125,000 pages of evidence that the prosecutors have in their receipt in relation to this case. So you can imagine then what happened in terms of the Savile inquiry. So 1998, who was then Prime Minister Tony Blair, said, right, there's going to be a new inquiry headed by Judge Lord Savile. And so that took 12 years. Became the longest running inquiry in British legal history. It cost about £200 million. And I remember very clearly the day sitting watching in the newsroom, live as the findings were delivered in the Guildhall in Derry, and you see, one of the victims' families putting their thumb out the window and giving the thumbs up, and the crowd all cheers, because that meant, that they'd got what they wanted in terms of the truth about what had happened. So the inquiry had found then that none of the casualties were posing a threat or doing anything that could have possibly justified the shooting, and the then British Prime Minister David Cameron apologised in Parliament for the killings and said that they were unjustified and unjustifiable, I think was the phrase he used.
Yeah.
So after that, the family says, well, there's evidence in this that needs to be examined. So the PSNI started a murder investigation. And so it took till I think that was however many years that took. They presented the files to the PPS towards the end of 2016. So that's how long this part of it has been going on. I had actually, we had thought looking through Savile that there could have maybe been the prosecution of 2 or more soldiers. But after then they went through that and decided then that Soldier F was going to be prosecuted. But then we had another case which collapsed. It was the case of 2 soldiers who had been charged in relation to Troubles killing. And the PPS said after that, look, none of these cases are viable. They're not going anywhere. And so they withdrew them all. The families then appealed that, and that became another legal challenge. And so we're now at the position earlier this week that they announced that Soldier F would in fact face prosecution. Although the question is, will he? Because remember, we have legacy legislation that is currently being challenged in the High Court in Belfast, and what comes of that High Court challenge, I think that in the end will dictate whether or not Soldier F is actually prosecuted.
I mean, what a marathon they've been through. I was actually up in Derry recently and I interviewed William McKinney's brother, Michael, John Kelly, who lost his brother, and Kieran Shields, one of the 2 solicitors you've mentioned. And he showed me the whole area where there was 13 people shot dead and 15 others injured when members of that Army Parachute Regiment opened fire on the civil rights demonstration. It's tiny. It's like, it's in the Bogside, but it's like the size, so small. And we looked at exactly where people fled, and we spoke about how many of them were shot in the back as they were running and all the rest of it. I'd never properly applied myself to Bloody Sunday, and I had never been in Derry before, actually. But, so it was really interesting, and I got very interested in the case because of it. And Soldier F sort of, I actually popped on to the case the other day on the link, and I heard him talking. Now, he only talked to answer that he was there. And they asked him, was he going to give any evidence? And he said no. And they asked him another question. He replied no. He was obviously one of the many significant people there that day, but, he's accused at least of being a murderer, a mass murderer, really, on that day. While the orders were given, the soldiers seemed to have lied to the first inquiry, given false statements, lied all the way. And by the sounds of him the other day, he is pissed off at the position he's in, very clipped in his answers. He just sounds sort of, I have to say, kind of arrogant and really unhappy where he's at, but clearly they're going to wait and see what the result of that High Court is as to whether or not this will go ahead. But Soldier F, where has he been since? Do we know anything about him? Like, he was only a young man then, wasn't he? He was in his early 20s. He was in this parachute regiment. He was a highly trained, highly skilled killer, sniper. And he's, in the last 52 years, what's he been doing?
Well, a lot of those soldiers, some of them left the army straight off that, some of them stayed on. We've had cases like, last month, just in November, you had the death at the age of 90 of Lieutenant Colonel Derek Wilford, who was in charge and in command of the Parachute Regiment on Bloody Sunday. He's the man who was given the orders. But as you said, Soldier F seemed to be the one who was doing he did a lot of the shooting on that day. And the thing that struck me, and the same, I've done that sort of walk where you walk through where the barricade was, where the shooting happened, and people, I suppose, maybe are or not surprised to know that there's still bullet holes in the walls from Bloody Sunday, and you can still see them if you walk up along that way, and you can see the exact spot where some of those bullets hit. And it is tiny, as you said, and everybody in Derry's not a big place yet anyway, but everybody in Derry knows someone who's either killed or injured, or who's on, at least someone who's on that civil rights march that day. It has such an impact on that city, and it has such an impact on it lasting until this day. So Soldier F obviously was one of the renegade soldiers. There's a whole I suppose story list that goes into what happened then too, because a lot of those soldiers then, some of them left the army. And remember, a lot of soldiers at that time, especially British soldiers, were, I suppose, what they would have called There were economic recruits. There were people who came from, poorer parts of the north of England, and a lot of them went on then to be mercenaries and joined mercenary groups and fought in other places and other conflicts in Angola, especially. Some of the Bloody Sunday soldiers showed up. And that was because they were called the Wild Geese, the film The Wild Geese. That's obviously based on that's what they call renegade soldiers who go turn into mercenaries. Some of the Bloody Sunday soldiers showed up there. Now, Soldier F wasn't one of them, but yeah, there's a whole campaign in England led by people like Johnny Mercer. One very posh Tory told me that they call them the military wing of the Conservative Party. People who either were ex-soldiers or who served constituencies that would have huge army bases on it, so therefore obviously a lot of their voters. And they are the people that have pushed for this current legislation that I've just spoke about, the legislation that will then give an amnesty to anyone who gives information in relation to the Troubles. And that is one of the reasons why that was pushed through, is because when Boris Johnson fancied himself as being leader of the Conservative Party, he promised those backbenchers, those military wing of the Conservative Party, that he would find a way to make sure that there was no more prosecutions. And so he then pushed that through. It carries on as it is to this day. It has been changed, obviously, after he left as British Prime Minister. It was changed and amended quite considerably in the Lords, but it's currently being challenged in the High Court. Another legal firm, Phoenix Law, are dealing with the victims, the three test cases in that case, to see whether it's compliant with European human rights law. But if it is, Soldier F, I'll never see the inside of the court, and that's true. So it was actually just looking there was Soldier G, who was one of the other people who was present in Bloody Sunday. He went to Angola to work as a paid mercenary, and he was killed in Angola, and apparently his body was never found. He was linked to the shooting of Gerard McKinney and Gerald Donaghy on that day, and he had also the killing of Jim Ray. He was the person who worked alongside Soldier F. They worked in like cars. Yeah. And he ended up working as a mercenary in Angola with a guy who I maintain, if someone hasn't written a book about this, they really should. A guy called Costas Georgiou. He was a paratrooper. He was from British Cyprus, and he was the only reason he wasn't on Bloody Sunday. And you could argue that if Costas Georgiou had have made his way to Bloody Sunday that day, that the death toll would have been 3 or 4 times that, because he had been dishonourably discharged. He had taken guns from an army base. They'd robbed a post office, and so he was in a military prison on the day of Bloody Sunday because he had stolen, it was £93 from a post office in Bangor. And had he been there, people who were involved in the military at that time said the death toll could have been 2 or 3 times that, because he was an absolute lunatic. He went on to Angola to work as a mercenary and ended up actually leading the Angolan army. Right. And he was killed. He killed a lot of his men because he became paranoid, thought they were all trying to overthrow him and take his job. And Soldier J is one of the ones who then lost his life working for him. He advertised in an SAS magazine. It was called the Pegasus Journal. It was with a parachute regiment. It was a magazine of the parachute regiment, and they advertised there. So a lot of those Bloody Sunday parachute regiment soldiers, that's where they ended up, though, at Angola. Who's afforded them the letters as opposed to their identities, and why is that? Obviously because the military wouldn't, I don't suppose as a society we would agree with identifying military personnel or people working. We see it quite a lot even now, where if there's members of the security forces, members of PSNI charged with offences, and they can be like domestic offences. Quite recently, there's a police officer who's charged in connection with an incident that took place at a wedding in the Galvorm Hotel, right. And he tried to get anonymity, saying, my life's under threat, and the judge says, no, there's no immediate threat. So what they would say is, because it's such a high-profile case and because of their background in the military, that it would put their lives at risk. And so Soldier G, even, who's dead, I couldn't name. I did an article about Soldier G going to Angola, and him and Costas Georgiou run around Angola like 2 balloons, but I couldn't name him even in death, because that anonymity order lasts even in their death. So they've been given that, and we'll see that quite. So you've had, Soldier B, Soldier A. We see quite a lot of them are given anonymity, but then you have people like Dennis Hutchins, who wasn't convicted. He was mid-trial for the murder of John Joe Cunningham, and he he died of COVID basically halfway through the trial. He was named. He tried to get anonymity and hadn't. So it depends. It's case by case basis whether the judge awards them. But all of the Bloody Sunday soldiers have anonymity until death.
So we've got the families who have been campaigning for all this time, and having met some of them, they seem to be as strong as ever they were to kind of see this out. You know, the Savile inquiry was a great day for them. They talk about that, and they talk about, you know, that sense of finally their loved ones who were accused of all sorts of criminality and rioting and stuff were kind of, you know, they were given the dignity they deserved, but that they sort of almost immediately dust themselves down and said, this isn't enough. You know, we still are fighting for more. I find it extraordinary that after all those years, they still have the energy in them. And then, of course, a lot of them are involved with the museum there in Derry, where you can go in and you can see some of the clothing and the photographs and everything that happened on that day. Well worth a visit for anybody who's in the area. But so you have
Did it not strike you when you were in the museum how small the clothing was?
Yes, I know.
That we're only talking about 50 years ago, but people were just tiny, and there's these tiny little jackets, and these were, you know, teenage, you know, young men or teenage boys, but I mean, everything just looks so miniature almost.
It's what we aspire to again, you know, to go back. I think their diets probably were the reasoning for it.
It's such a poignant. It's very simply done. The Bloody Sunday Museum, it's not all bells and whistles and interact. It's just very simple, and it's very, very, very poignant, I thought. And that's where said, I mean, anyone who visits, it's said, if you go around the side of it, you'll see the perspex covering the bullet holes from that day. And
it's good the way you can, you know, a lot of people working in it have connections to it. I think probably a lot of people in Derry know somebody, as you said, that's kind of not huge, but you can talk to them, you know, as you're going around, or then they're very willing to chat to you. But so you have that going on, and then you have Soldier F in his 70s, somewhere out there, we don't know where in the world, coming in on remotely into the courtroom. Do you think he's feeling worried, or?
I think he's probably pissed off at this stage because, you know, these people did for a long time think that because they were, you know, in the pay of the state at the time, that they were untouchable and that they would never see the inside of a court. And obviously he's been told by people in government that this amnesty would protect him from future prosecutions, and it may well still. And even if the court rules that any cases that are in train, which it now is because they've announced their prosecution, so you could argue this is now in train, that have to continue, and it's just no new cases will be prosecuted as a result of the new legislation. The legislation also changed the Sentencing Act as part of the Good Friday Agreement, which said that anyone charged with the Good Friday Agreement stated that anyone convicted of any offence that happened before 1998 would only serve 2 years in prison. So any convictions, and there's only been a handful that have happened since then, the people responsible have only served 2 years. The Sentencing Act's now been put back to 0. So even if it convicted, he'll never serve a single day in prison. But I suppose he doesn't particularly want to come to Northern Ireland, back to, let's face it, you know, the scene of the crime, as they say, to stand trial. And he'll probably argue that the trial shouldn't take place in Derry, where, you know, motions would be high and there'd be a whole. So we'll see how that goes, and if they do. And it's difficult because people get built up and they get, you know, they get good news and they think this is great, and then they get knocked down again because something else happens. And for the Bloody Sundays, I mean, talk about a roller coaster. They have been up and down in terms of what they received. And you say that was a euphoric day in Derry, the day of the Savile findings, and their loved ones were vindicated in terms of that. And then, you know, they have had many of their hopes dashed and then raised again in terms of the prosecution. But it is interesting because they've stayed such a tight unit. A lot of times when I deal with those campaign groups, they start off as one, and then as the years go on, you know, different sort of agendas and loyalties, and, you know, and people then end up falling out, and we get splinter groups and splinters of splinter groups, and yet they have stayed as a very tight unit, and that's interesting. It's good to see, and you would hope that they will, you know, see their day in court. And even if that court case does not result in him never spending a day in prison, what it does do is it puts evidence and disclosure into the public domain, and for a lot of people, even that can be quite a sort of healing process as it is. But I mean, I remain sceptical as someone who has worked here, you know, for I think it's 24 years this year in journalism. I remain sceptical that, you know, that people who are accused of actions while in the pay of the state, you know, justice doesn't usually come visiting them. Let's say that.
It certainly complicates it. I suppose we'll finish up with the, you know, what happened today. Bizarre. Jamie Bryson admits on X formerly Twitter, that he is the complainant behind this very peculiar situation in Derry, that there was members of the Bloody Sunday families walking together to a courthouse in the city. And as you say, they are a very together group and very united and all the rest of it in relation to prosecution for Soldier F. And there was a complaint made to the PSNI that this was a kind of a march, and that the people involved should be investigated for having an unlawful sort of demonstration. Now, the SDLP leader, Colm Eastwood, it sort of presented himself, I think, to Derry Police Station for interview, was left sitting for 20 minutes and then walked out the door and said he wasn't having any more to do with it. It sounds the most ludicrous thing I've ever heard in my life. And maybe for the southern listeners, I know you're probably the northern listeners know, but just briefly, who is Jamie Bryson?
Well, Jimmy Bryson is like a sort of, I suppose we refer to him as a loyalist, activist and blogger. He's someone who would actually be quite close to thinking of the DUP, and that's been shown in recent times in terms of he would have led those anti-protocol protests. In connection with this, we have the Parades Commission. The Parades Commission is something that came from the Jum Cree dispute. It was set up to try and give sort of arbitrary judgments in terms of whether parades should be allowed to go ahead or not go ahead. It was particularly designed because we had conflict every summer around those parades. It certainly wasn't designed for this purpose. But he's claiming that this was an unlawful possession. I think that had somebody went and made a complaint about, victims from an IRA atrocity, walking in unison, giving each other support, going to a courthouse, you'd like to think that the PSNI would have told them to jog on and wise up to themselves, So the fact that, they're calling people in to even voluntarily be questioned for this, they'll argue, we have to tick a box if there's a complaint, we have to tick it, unlikely to go anywhere, but whatever. But at the same time, too, I think there has to be common sense in terms of things like this. If someone tries to do something for a publicity stunt, I think it's if it was any other circumstances, you'd go, well, political publicity stunts are part of the course. It's part of the rough and tumble of that world. But when it comes to victims of an atrocity and grieving families, I think that the police in that circumstance should have said, no, we're not even accepting this complaint, wise up to yourself.
And Bryson's point being that, exactly as we've just been talking, that, people in service of the state and the military shouldn't be sort of pursued.
That's a completely different argument, though. That's a completely different argument than people walking in possession. Yeah. So, that's go and debate that all you want in terms of should there be prosecutions. But the point is, if there is an amnesty, which is what the British government wanted for soldiers, they were told quite clearly there can't be an amnesty for one, there has to be an amnesty for all. Mm-hmm. So that means that, the two people who we know who were responsible for the Shankill bomb, Sean Kelly, who was convicted, and Thomas Begbie, who died in that bomb, are clearly not the only two people involved in the Shankill bomb. There's clearly a whole network of people who were involved in that. So they will also benefit from the amnesty. So remember that, if we get an amnesty for soldiers, you get an amnesty for everyone. And the amnesty then applies to people who carried out attacks on the community that people like Jimmy Bryson would say they represent.
We shouldn't have given him any publicity there, should we?
Well, something, I think it's valid. It's valid in terms of what we're talking about. Yeah. The fact is that the Bloody Sunday families have had an incredible journey. And what we had just said is they have stayed tight as a unit, and they made a decision that day, we're going to walk in a very dignified way to the courthouse, and that's what they did. I think for them, particularly, that was obviously a big day for them, and it was something they wanted to do. Their MP walked with them, as you would expect if you're elected to represent people. And so, I think it's valid to give it a mention, but it's not obviously their main. I'm sure it's hardly keeping them awake, nor is it their main objective concern.
No, I hope not. It's ridiculous, and I think it makes the PSNI look ridiculous as well. And I can say that because
nothing around here that make the PSNI look ridiculous. We'll have to talk about some of them at a later date.
Oh, stop. Well, listen, thanks a million for updating on that, and have a great weekend.
Thank you very much. I hope I will. I'm going to head out tomorrow night and have some tapas and some wine to celebrate Christmas, because I've spent most of this week doing other things.
Yes, I know. Yeah. It's been busy. Well, listen, we will talk soon. Maybe it'll be nearly the new year at this stage, will it?
It probably will be the new year. And who knows what.
Yeah, even crime journalists need a break, don't they?
Or come our way between now and then.
All right. Thanks a million.
wherever you and I go, Nicola, chaos follows.
Thanks, Allison.
Talk to you soon.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.